So I'm going to show you a hack that I've created from the Carnaby dress pattern. I'm going to be making this in a lovely wool boucle, so a nice sort of autumn winter weight. I'm going to do in an open fronted G-lace type top, little sleeveless jumper, tank top type of thing. So from my original pattern, I've cut the yoke as it was before, the back yoke, and then part of the back bodice. Now, for me, I like it quite cropped. So from the armhole, I have measured down 26 centimetres from the armhole, and that's my cut length there. Of course, you can make this any length that you like. So those two pieces I'll be stitching together across. Important thing to note as well is you'll realise that there's no centre seam down this. So instead of cutting two back pieces, I folded the pattern piece to take off the seam allowance in the centre, and then I've cut it out on the fold instead. There's no need for a seam on this back piece here, and to keep it simple, we just cut it out on the fold. I've made sure that the front pieces are cut to the same length at the side as the back, but I've also extended this front placket area here. So before, on your original pattern, there'll be a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance there. I've extended that from this point here to 4 centimetres, and that's so that I can fold that back to 2 centimetres in half, and that will become a button placket. So we want buttons going down the front there. So that's the cutting out for the outer. Darts in as normal. And then for the facings, I have cut the back out as per the dress. So nothing changed there. So that's the same pattern as the Carnaby dress facing. And then for the front facings, again, I've just extended that front section there to 4 centimetres to mimic the additional 4, or the additional centimetres we put on here to make it to 4. So my first thing I'm going to do is attach the back yoke to the back of the top there. So I'm going to stitch that with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. The yoke and the back piece are now stitched together, and I have overlocked each seam individually, so not overlock them together purely because this fabric is a little bit bulky. If I was to do them both together, it would create a little bit too much bulk on the back. So if we overlock them separately, it creates much less bulk. And what I'm going to do now is that needs pressing. So it's quite a buoyant fabric. So I'm going to use a wooden clapper. And the idea of the clapper is that you put some steam from your iron onto the part that you want to flatten out. So quite a lot of steam going in there without actually touching the iron onto the fabric itself. So you're getting all of that heat in there. And then you take your wooden clapper and you press down on that seam and keep it there for 10 seconds or so. And what this does is it helps retain the heat and flatten the seam without adding any extra heat and running the risk of shrinking the garment. So you see, and you do that a few times, and it gives a really nice crisp finish. Now that that seam is nice and flat, I'm going to do 2 rows of top stitching either side of the seam there, and that will just ensure that these seams stay in place and they don't flap backwards and forwards. So yes, just a top stitch, a few, probably 5 millimeters from the seam either side all the way across. The back piece is now finished, top stitched. I used the left side foot of the sewing foot and lined it up with that centre seam there, so it gives about a 5-6 millimetre seam. Looks nice. So onto the front pieces. Cut 2 strips of interfacing, 2 centimetres wide, and whatever the length is that you've decided to cut from the front top section to the hem. We're going to iron one to the left side and one to the right side. This will just give us a little bit more of a stable base when we come to do our buttonholes and put the buttons on. When the interfacing has had time to cool down and dry properly into the fabric, we're going to overlock the outside edge here. The reason why we're going to do that is because this eventually will turn to the back, lining up your corner edge there with the little angle there, and that's going to become your placket. So that'll be overlocked, and then we'll stitch down that as well. So this is ironed on to the reverse side of the front, so it's ironed onto the wrong side of the front. Once we've overlocked those edges, we're going to pop the darts in as we would pop them in to the dress, so exactly the same way. The long edge is overlocked, so we're going to turn over to the wrong side, that placket, to 2 centimetres, so it's half the width. It's where your interfacing stops. I'm just going to pin up that edge and then stitch close to the edge where the overlocking stitch is, so you'll have a top stitch on the other side, and that's going to secure the placket. Pinned down the front and ready to stitch. So I've pressed out those centre fronts again with using the wooden clapper to get them nice and flat. Purely doing that because it's a buoyant fabric. Next step is to pin the darts and give them a stitch. So you start from the outside, work your way to the apex, stop a couple of millimetres from the apex or a stitch from the apex, and then tie off your edges. This helps to avoid a point at the apex, which nobody wants. The bust darts are sewn in and pressed down. And the next thing to do is to attach the 2 fronts to the back at the shoulder seam. So right sides together. We're going to stitch with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance across the top of both the shoulder seams, and then as we did here, we'll overlock them separately, press them out, and maybe top stitch them down if they're sticking up a little bit. You can decide that yourselves depending on which fabric you choose to use, but it's always an option to do that nice top stitching effect. I have just pressed out the shoulder seams. I'm not going to overlock these because we're going to have a facing that's going to cover over the top of these, and I don't want to create any additional bulk. It's good to have it on the back because you're going to get a bit of strain across your back, but you don't necessarily need it on the shoulder. So next thing to do is right sides together and stitch, pin and stitch down each side seam with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance, and that will be the outer part finished to a point until we then go on to do the facing. That's the outer complete. I've overlocked the side seams together and then pressed towards the centre back. So that's the outer almost complete. So onto the facings now. So facings are cut as per the dress, but with the extra bit added as we did on the outer piece for the placket centre. So that's your shoulder seam up there, and that's your centre. So what we're going to do first is overlock this edge here and then the curved edge at the bottom. The front facings are overlocked on the edges, and I've pressed under at the centre front point 2 centimetres, so that mimics the placket on the front of the outer. So press under, no need to stitch at this point, just press under 2 centimetres, and then we're going to join the front and the back facings at the shoulder seams. So pin and stitch along there. The shoulder seams are stitched and pressed open, no need to overlock these. We do also need to overlock the bottom edge of the back facing too. Once that is overlocked, we're going to line up the side seams with right sides together and stitch here and here with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. That's after doing an overlock stitch at the bottom there. Time to attach the facing to the outer around the neckline. So we're going to have the main face side out and the facing inside out. Just slip the facing on top so your right sides together. Line up your shoulder seams on each side and pin. And there we go, and just make sure that they're aligned correctly and pin into place. And then we're going to pin all the way around the neckline, right round to the front, so all the way along here, around the back and back round to the front. Stitch that with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. Clip where you need to clip on any curves. You might find that you have to ease your fabrics together, as I have done. So this wool boucle has a lot more give than the cotton poplin. So one way around that, especially on your curved edges, one way around that to have a nice distribution of fabric, make it nice and flat, is to pop your pins in vertically from the edge instead of horizontally. It gives you a lot more room for ease and to get a nice flat finish. So that's pinned all the way from the front edge there, so we're going to stitch across, up there, round the back, down the front again and across the top. The facing is now attached to the outer around all the neck edges, so we just want to snip into this seam allowance all the way around, especially on the back neck where it curves a little bit, just to give a little more structure, make it look a little flatter. And then we can trim down the seam on the facing side as well, and then we're going to press all of that to the inside. So I've trimmed into all of those edges. I am going to understitch this as well so that it prevents the facing from kicking out. So to understitch, you send all of your seam allowance towards your facing, away from the main garment, and then you are stitching on the facing side 2 or 3 millimeters from the seam, and that secures all of these bits of seam allowance to the facing, taking it away from the outer fabric, so it gives it a natural sort of curvature around that neck edge there. The neckline is all nicely pressed out with the facing sewn in and intact. So the thing to address now is the armhole. So I'm going to use bias binding. I'm going to make some bias binding out of this fabric here, and I'm going to sew bias binding around the armholes and possibly around the hem as well. See, when you're doing hacks of things, you can kind of almost make things up as you go along. Obviously you have an idea of what you want to do, but when it comes to the detailing, you can kind of just see how you go as you go along. So maybe, you know, maybe I just want to hem it like that, but you know, maybe it might look nice with a bit of bias binding. That's the freedom that you have when you do your own pattern drafting and your hacks. So yes, so I'm going to first and foremost pin the armhole facing and the outer together. I'm going to just do a little basting stitch around there first, and then I shall go and make some bias binding, I think, and attach that around each armhole. I have cut my bias binding. I've cut strips of 4 centimetres wide, and then ironed in the edges. And so just starting underneath the arm hole, just on the bottom edge there, I'm going to start pinning, leaving a little tail at one end. I'm just going to pin that all the way around the armhole to the other side. Pinned on all around the armhole edges and ready to stitch. We're going to stitch where we ironed that crease into one of the long edges of the bias binding. Just follow that, use that as your guide all the way around. When you get to this bit at the end here, the tail end, we're just going to sew, take the 2 pieces together and sew acrossways, trim off, and then we can turn through and affix the bias binding to the right side. So at the underarm we have these 2 extra bits here, so we're going to hold them right sides together, pop a little pin horizontally across there, and then stitch from this end up to the pin, and then we can trim this excess off. Then it's time to pin the bias binding to the inside. So you have another folded edge that we ironed previously, so this is the inside. So you want to just bring your bias binding to the back like so, and then pop pins in the ditch, if you like. So you're going to be stitching in the ditch on the front like that, catching the turn up of the bias binding on the back. Do that all the way around, make sure it's all flush, nothing's twisting, and stitch. So starting stitching at the underarm, you're aiming your needle in the ditch, essentially on the outside, so at the right edge of the bias binding on the outside before it hits the fabric, and then we're going to stitch in the ditch all the way around till we get to the other end. You'll end up with something that looks a little bit like this. So you've caught all of the inside edges. It's just showing on the outside there. It looks nice. So the next thing to do is a little bit of hand stitching. So we can hand tack the facings to the inside of the main. Just a few little hand tacks all the way along. We'll secure that in place. Down the front edge also. I have decided that I'm going to use bias binding on the bottom edge. I think it'd look really nice. So I did make enough bias binding earlier, so it'd be a shame not to use it. So I'm going to take my bias binding, and then first I'm going to fold over the short end to the back slightly, because I'm going to be starting at this centre front point. I don't want any raw edges. So as per normal with your bias binding, your right sides together, right up to the edge there, the front edge, pin all the way around, and then I will stitch that in place. So as before, we're going to aim the needle for this sort of seam area here, so stitching in the ditch in order to catch the bias binding on the back there. Everything is complete now apart from the buttons and the buttonholes. So I'm going to just place my buttons on where I think they might look nice. So you can eyeball this really. and it's to everybody's preference. So I think probably 5 buttons is enough on this length. If you did it longer, obviously you'd have more. You can just have one at the top if you like. You don't have to have buttons at all. It is completely up to you. That's the beauty of dressmaking. So I think that looks quite nice and balanced. So what I need to do now is mark the distance from the top to the first button, and then from each button thereafter, and then translate that across to the other side so that I know where to mark my buttonholes. So my buttonholes are going to be on the wearer's right side, because then you fasten that over. That's the female way to wear it. So I am going to just go grab a tape measure and measure down, and then mark on with a pin each section, each where the button's going to go. So I'm measuring from the top edge to the first button. So I'm measuring to where it's going to be stitched on, so into the 2 stitch holes. So that's 3 centimetres. And then from that centre point of the button to the next centre point of the button is 6 centimetres. So just make sure when you place your buttons that they are all equidistant from each other, which these are all 6 centimetres apart. So I know that I've got a 3 centimetre and then 6, 6, 6 and 6 again. So I'm going to mark that with a pin, or some pins now. I've marked where the pins are going to be, and then I've marked across on the wearer's right hand side where the corresponding buttonholes are going to be. Now I know that I want my buttonholes to start approximately 1 centimetre in from the outside edge, so I've put another pin forming this cross formation here, so that I know that I want to start at this point here where the pin is going vertically, and then my buttonholes will go across that way. So they should all start in the same place. Fingers crossed, wish me luck. So for buttonholes, every machine is different, but I'm going to show you how I set up my machine for buttonholes. So we have a buttonhole foot that has the option of putting your button in the back, so that your buttonhole is then automatically made to the correct size for the button. So that's really handy. So on our machines, we have the buttonhole setting here, and in between each buttonhole you have to turn it to the reset button, and then the stitch length there, it's somewhere within that buttonhole region, and then needle position central 5. So we bob this on. That buttonhole foot is now on, and then there's this little lever on most machines that has the little buttonhole logo, if you like, on there. So you pull that down to the back of your zip foot, and that's what guides the size of your buttonhole. And then when you start stitching, it will stitch across the front here first, usually on most machines, and then it will go away from you, so it will go back up that way, across the back, and then back down to the front. So just be mindful of where you position your buttonhole foot when you're sewing. With that in mind, I am starting from, so that's the front edge there, that's the bottom end. I'm starting from this edge at the top, which is very brave because it's the first one you see. So the machine will stitch across, away from me, across, and then back towards me. First one done, and I'm happy with that, so I'm happy to proceed with the other 4. So once the buttonholes are in, the next thing to do is to slice the hole open. So what I like to do is to pop a pin either end of the buttonhole, so that when you use your seam ripper to slice it open, you don't go beyond the buttonhole. So just a little tip there. So you just take your seam ripper and very carefully open up that buttonhole, and the pins will prevent you from tearing that right open. And there it is, complete with the buttons on that I hand stitched on. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope it's given you the confidence to do more with your patterns and to try out some of our